Legendary spells are one of the rarest and most iconic types of cards in the game. So in this list, we'll be going over the worst of the bunch that aren't quest or questlines. And at number 10, we have Floop's Glorious Gloop. This 1-mana druid spell has the effect where, whenever any minion dies this turn, you gain a full mana crystal. It's worth noting that this card only gives you mana until the end of the turn, but can go above the number of mana crystals you have. And of all of the cards in this list, this is the only one that sees any competitive play in Wild, the most powerful game mode of Hearthstone, though it's only ever seen in one very specific deck. It's worth noting that, for the most part, legendary spells are actually quite good for how few of them there are. Quite a few of them have seen some play during their standard rotation, or to fulfill very specific niches that some Wild decks needed. Gloop found its home in the notorious Line Cracker Druid, which uses a combo to gain about 2,500 armor in one turn, making them pretty much unkillable before their opponent died to fatigue or jade golems. Although this deck may seem very strong, especially with how unkillable Druid has become nowadays, it's still easily rushed down by any aggro deck before they can pull off their combo. Floop's Glorious Gloop just has to take the number 10 spot on this list because, although it sees some play, the remaining 5 legendary spells not included on this list are just leaps and bounds better than every other card. All of these cards have been played as staples in very good decks in the past, with many of them having to be nerfed because of how overtuned they were. And at number 9, we have Soul Mirror. Soul Mirror is a 7-mana legendary pre-spell that creates a copy of all of your opponent's minions and forces them to attack into their copies. You also get to keep the copies that survive, but most of the time you want to use this card to just clear your opponent's board. While this card may seem like a cheaper Twisting Nether with a potential upside, this card is actually way clunkier to use than it may first appear. First of all, if you want to just clear your opponent's board, all of their minions have to have more attack than their health, so that your clones can actually have enough attack to kill your opponent's copies. In which case, it just becomes a more expensive light bomb, considered to be a pretty poor board clear nowadays. Also, if you do have any minions on the field, you may run into board size issues where you don't have enough room to create any copies of your opponent's minions, in which case they would remain unharmed. So, why isn't this card further down if it's just been a subpar removal? Priest is a class that has plenty of other options for efficient removal, but sometimes in really slow control matchups, they really want to steal one of their opponent's death rattle minions or high attack health minions to use for themselves. And what's really funny about this card is that it's probably the best card that no one wants to put in their deck, since Priest can discover this card multiple times per game from one of their many discover effects. It's a dead card in most matchups, but you can expect to see it from discoveries quite a lot since legendaries have a higher chance to occur than other cards. This card really only saw play in decks in Standard when Psychic Scream just rotated out and Priests were really desperate for more board wipes. Out of all the cards in the game, it's really not that bad. It's just among the worst out of the pretty good subset of cards. And at number 8, we have Deck of Lunacy. This 4-mana legendary mage spell turns all the spells into your deck into other random spells that cost 3 more originally, but they still cost the same as their original spell. So, if you were to play this with a fireball in your deck, it could transform it into a Mask of Cthulhu that would only cost 4 mana. Originally, this card cost 2 mana and saw a ton of play when it first came out, and was played in a spell-only mage deck. The deck was busted, especially with how much spell mage support had just come out. Encounter's Flow could reduce the cost of your entire deck for only 2 mana, Refreshing Spring Water was a guaranteed 0 mana draw 2, Apex's Blast gave amazing value, and simply playing a Deck of Lunacy would generate so much advantage that the game would just end after a couple of turns. There was a perfect storm of good spell support and good random spells in the game, where all spell mage became too meta shaping. Blizzard nerfed the entire package, with Deck of Lunacy getting hit hard to become nerfed to 4 mana. However, even in its heyday, Deck of Lunacy saw no play in Wild because spell mage was still too slow to even compete with control decks. Deck of Lunacy relies on having enough time to draw your transformation spells and generating good spells, neither of which can happen with how fast Wild is and how bad random spells are in Wild. The nerfs really didn't help it either, especially since 4 mana is just way too much to be paying for a card that doesn't immediately do anything when it's played. But it's still better than the rest of the cards in this list, which saw no play even when they were in rotation. And at number 7, we have Mira's Unstable Element. This legendary rogue spell makes you draw the rest of your deck, and that's it. So, for 5 mana, this card would refill your hand with 10 cards from your deck, burn the rest of it, and put you into fatigue. For how simple the card is, the effect has the potential to win you the game by drawing 10 cards, and this fact did not go unnoticed. Odd Rogue in Wild was very powerful, and the deck was looking for good, odd mana cost finishers at the time. You see, with how Baku the Moon Eater made you build your Odd Rogue deck, cards had to either cost 1, 3, 5, 7, or 9 mana to get the amazing upgraded hero power at the start of the game. So as a result, almost all of the cards in the aggro Odd Rogue cost 1 mana, meaning they ran out of steam very quickly. To remedy this, some players thought to use Myras to refill their hand and try to push for lethal. The problem with this card though isn't the downside of going into fatigue, but with how expensive it is. When you play this card, you're already accepted the game will end very soon, so the little amount of fatigue damage you take doesn't really matter. What does matter though is when you play Myras, you can't really apply that much pressure with the mana you have left, especially when it's before turn 10. You pretty much have to just play Myras, end your turn, play as many cards as you can afterwards, and hope your opponent didn't have one final board clear. The fact that it cost 5 mana, which is hugely expensive for any aggro deck, meant that you pretty much had to have a dead turn when you played Myras to refuel. Ultimately, it saw play for like a month or two, was quickly replaced with better options, and has never been considered for any aggro rogue deck since. And at number 6, we have Stormbringer. This 6 mana legendary shaman spell transforms all of your minions into random legendary minions. While this sounds great and possibly worth building your deck around, this effect is actually really bad. Throughout Hearthstone's history, Blizzard has had this idea that generating random legendary minions is somehow a worthwhile effect, when in reality, many legendaries are unstatted, need deck-specific synergies to be remotely playable, and are just small most of the time. Even back when Elisa's Starseeker was first printed, and Control Warriors tried to rush out Golden Monkeys, which replaced your hand and deck with random legendary minions, there were still a huge number of unplayable or garbage legendaries you can generate. Since then, Blizzard has continued to dilute the legendary minion pool by printing even more small legendary minions, which has made Stormbringer inconsistent at best. While there is the possibility to get some really great legendaries, on average you're just going to get 3 3s with no relevant effects for 6 mana. When it was first released, it actually cost 7 mana, and was even worse than it is now. Shaman was in a rough spot and had no zoo decks that could even feasibly build around it, so it was left untouched for years. Fairly recently though, the Stormbringer was buffed to cost 6 mana, and saw some experimental play in even Shaman decks as a finisher. Oftentimes, even Shaman would be stuck on turn 6 with a board of totems, but no way to take advantage of them and close out the game. The Stormbreaker was used for a bit as a way to cheese out unwinnable games by transforming those totems into giant legendaries, but would most of the time turn your totems into slightly bigger legendary minions. And although Even Shaman was better at the deck than Odd Rogue, the version of Even Shaman that Stormbringer was in was very bad in its meta, whereas Myra's was at least used during Odd Rogue's rise to power. And at number 5, we have Xerx's Cloning Gallery. This 9 mana legendary pre-spell creates 1/1 copies of each minion from your deck. Or if you have 7 or more minions in your deck, it fills your board with 1/1 copies. I think the intended use of this card is to run a bunch of good Death Rattle minions, have them die quickly, and then gain value off of this card. But in almost every situation, it's just too slow for what it does. For one, unless your summoned 1/1s are a threat or have taunt, your opponent is going to ignore your board and continue their own game plan. Xerx doesn't offer enough pressure either, with only 7 attack on board at most, so it'll usually just be 9 mana to do nothing for that turn. When the card first came out, it saw the briefest amount of play in Wild as another threat in Big Priest. This deck aimed to cheat out small versions of their big, game-winning minions with cards like Barnes and Shadow Essence. Have those small copies die, then resurrect those minions to their normal stats with Resurrect or Eternal Servitude. And the main reason Xerx saw some experimental play in this deck is because Big Priest only ran minions that would be good as 1/1s or with their normal stats. The thinking went that if Big Priest were able to live until turn 9, the board of 1/1s that Xerx's Cloning Gallery would make would actually be a substantial threat, and possibly be enough to win the game against certain matchups. The only issue was getting to turn 9, since what Big Priest struggled with the most was getting completely obliterated by aggro. Most of the time, Xerx would just be too expensive to ever play before dying, and with better late game threats, like Mass Resurrection, and early game removal coming out, like Penance, Xerx was completely outclassed, even if it was considered briefly in a historically powerful deck. And at number 4, we have Deck of Chaos. This 5 mana legendary Warlock spell has a unique effect to swap the mana cost and attack of all the minions in your deck. And actually, when this card first came out, it cost 6 mana and not 5. This card works best in a minion-heavy deck with low attack, high mana minions. For example, if you were to play a Deck of Chaos and then draw into Moshog Enforcer, it would become a 2 mana 8/14 with Taunt and Divine Shield. So why is this card so low on the list? Well, it's mainly because it's another legendary spell that does nothing immediately when you play it, and because the minions you have to run with the Deck of Chaos are quite bad. You see, Deck of Chaos only affects the minions in your deck, and not the ones on your hand or battlefield. The faster and more zones a spell can target, the better it will be. Targeting the field is great because the effects are immediate. Targeting the hand is fine, but you still have to pay the mana cost to get their full effects. But targeting the deck and only the deck is the worst thing a spell can do because you have to draw and pay mana for the card to get any of its value. Basically, it doesn't matter how many 2 mana 8/14s you have in your deck if you can never draw or play any of them. Another huge issue is that even if you do build your deck around this card, you still have to hope you draw it early, since there are no specific spell searchers that can target Deck of Chaos. That means you'll probably have to play most of the game with your otherwise subpar minions, hope you can draw and play Deck of Chaos, and pray you don't die before you hopefully draw and play one of your swapped minions. And at number 3, we have Kangor's Endless Army. This 7 mana legendary paladin spell resurrects 3 random friendly mechs that died this game, and then they get to keep any magnetized buffs they might have had. Magnetic is a keyword that lets a minion with it add their stats and card text to another friendly mech. So if you had, let's say, a mech warper that had a Ziliax magnetized to it, Kangor's Endless Army would resurrect it as a 5/5 with Divine Shield, Taunt, Lifesteal, Rush, and the text of Mech Warper. But if an Annoyotron were buffed with Dino Size, Kangor's would only resurrect it as a 1/2 with Divine Shield and Taunt, and not with the Dino Size buff. Unlike other card games, Hearthstone has no graveyard, where you can select certain targets from it. All resurrect-like cards are random unless specified, meaning that Kangor's is just as likely to res a 1/1 as it is one of your huge mechs. And what doesn't help is that the mechs by nature need lots of early game board presence so they can stay on the board and use their synergy cards. Another thing that really hurts this card is that a lot of the best magnetic cards summon 1/1 mechs when they die. So even if you wanted to take advantage of the extra attack in Kangor's Endless Army, you'll just be hurting your chances of bringing back your huge mechs, since you'll also further dilute the res pool with those 1/1s. And since each 1/1 mech counts as a separate mech that died that game, you could potentially summon 3 1/1s even if they appear identical. Even if there is the potential to resummon only large mechs by cutting out all the small ones, mechs as a whole are pretty underpowered compared to some of the other tribes in the game. Many of them were printed in the second expansion of the game, and they've aged poorly over the years, with many of them becoming power crept or obsolete. Kangor suffers from the issue of having to deal with Hearthstone's random graveyard mechanic while being reliant on a weak tribe, which is why it's at the number 3 spot. And at number 2, we have Boomship. This hefty 9 mana warrior spell has the effect of directly playing 3 random minions from your hand and giving them rush, meaning they can attack immediately but only into other enemy minions. This card suffers most in this list from its very expensive mana cost for a poor effect. And what makes Boomship so much worse than the rest of this list is that it needs at least 3 other cards in your hand to get its maximum value. Like in other card games, drawing cards has a cost, and not playing them means they aren't doing anything to help you. Going -4 in card advantage is huge, and it essentially means that Boomship is a 9 mana 4 card combo that hopefully creates a big enough board that your opponent can't clear. Also, much like most of this list, this effect is random. So if you have any small unplayed minions in your hand, they could accidentally be pulled instead of one of your big ones. And even if you do build a deck with only big minions to be summoned by the Boomship, you still have to hope to draw the only copy of this card and be alive by turn 9 after doing basically nothing. Ultimately, paying so much in mana and in card advantage is just not worth it, especially for a spell that is somewhat underwhelming and unreliable in which minions it can summon. This card just ekes out over the number 1 spot though, and only because Warrior has slightly more support for this card than for what the number 1 cards class does. And at number 1, we have Flark's Boomzooka. This 7 mana legendary hunter spell directly plays 3 random minions from your deck, forces them to attack enemy minions, and then makes them all die. Usually any card in Hearthstone that can cheat minions out of your deck into the battlefield are immediately tested to see if they're broken, since not having to pay to draw or play minions is one of the best effects in the game. In fact, it's the reason why Patches, the only card that can do this for free, is one of the best cards of all time and sees play everywhere. Flark's Boomzooka, though, has some of the worst effects a big spell can have, all combined into one. First, this card uses the minions directly from your deck and not a copy of them. Nowadays, it's pretty rare for game finishers to not use a copy of a minion from your deck, and for good reason. By the time you're ever in a situation where you want to play Boomzooka, you also want to have enough late game threats left in your deck to win, or at the very least not go into fatigue first. But since Boomzooka directly summons 3 minions, it puts you a -3 in fatigue with the potential to kill your late game threats for a little benefit. It also can only target enemy minions, meaning the minions you summon can't go face, and can only clear a maximum of 3 enemy minions. And worst of all, the minions you do happen to summon die immediately afterwards. So any of the big minions you did summon can't stay on the board. I think Blizzard meant this spell to be used as a removal spell that also synergized with Death Rattle minions in your deck. But to get any sort of value from it, you need to run few large Death Rattle minions, which just runs into the anti-synergy of burning your only threats. And even if you decide to run it as a mid-range or control hunter, you still have the chance to accidentally kill your best minions, or not even kill any of your opponent's minions if you pull any small ones from your deck. Just about the only positive thing this card has going for it is that you can only run 1 copy in your deck instead of 2, which would make the deck even worse. In fact, you could remove 2 of its restrictions and still not want to pay 7 mana for the effect. This card takes the cake as the worst legendary spell, since it's so limited and not even worth building a deck around its awful payout. Alright, and that's the list. If you have any ideas for future videos just like this one, I'd love to hear about your own ideas down in the comments.